As early as 1537, Pope Paul III, who hoped to see Indians become devout subjects of Catholic monarchs, outlawed their enslavement, an edict never extended to apply to Africans. His decree declared Indians to be truly men, who must not be treated as dumb beasts. 15 years later, the Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas published an account of the decimation of the Indian population with the compelling title, A Very Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. Las Casas's father had sailed on Columbus's second voyage, and he himself had participated in the conquest of Cuba. But in 1514, Las Casas freed his own Indian slaves and began to preach against the injustices of Spanish rule. Las Casas's writings denounced Spain for causing the death of millions of innocent people. He narrated in shocking detail the strange cruelties carried out by the Christians, including the burning alive of men, women, and children, and the imposition of forced labor. The Indians, he wrote, had been totally deprived of their freedom and were put in the harshest, fiercest, most terrible servitude and captivity. Long before the idea was common, Las Casas insisted that Indians were rational beings, not barbarians, and that Spain had no grounds on which to deprive them of their lands and liberty. The entire human race is one, he proclaimed, and while he continued to believe that Spain had a right to rule in America, largely on religious grounds, he called for Indians to enjoy all guarantees of liberty and justice from the moment they became subjects of Spain. Nothing is certainly more precious in human affairs, nothing more esteemed, he wrote, than freedom. Yet Las Casas also suggested that importing slaves from Africa would help to protect the Indians from exploitation. Largely because of Las Casas's efforts, Spain in 1542 promulgated the new laws, commanding that Indians no longer be enslaved. In 1550, Spain abolished the encomienda system, under which the first settlers had been granted authority over conquered Indian lands with the right to extract forced labor from the native inhabitants. In its place, the government established the repartimiento system, whereby residents of Indian villages remained legally free and entitled to wages, but were still required to perform a fixed amount of labor each year. The Indians were not slaves. They had access to land, were paid wages, and could not be bought and sold. But since the requirement that they work for the Spanish remained the essence of the system, it still allowed for many abuses by Spanish landlords and by priests who required Indians to toil on mission lands as part of the conversion process. Indeed, a long struggle ensued among settlers, missionaries, and colonial authorities for control of Indian labor. Each party proclaimed itself a humane overlord and denounced the others for exploiting the native population. By the end of the 16th century, work in the Spanish Empire consisted largely of forced wage labor by native inhabitants and slave labor by Africans on the West Indian Islands and a few parts of the mainland. Like all empires, Spain's always remained highly exploitative. Over time, the initial brutal treatment of Indians improved somewhat. The Spanish established their domination not just through violence and disease, but by bringing education, medical care, and European goods, and because many Indians embraced Christianity. But Las Casas's writings, translated almost immediately into several European languages, contributed to the spread of the Black Legend, the image of Spain as a uniquely brutal and exploitative colonizer. This would provide a potent justification for other European powers to challenge Spain's predominance in the New World. Influenced by Las Casas, the 18th century French historian Guillaume Thomas Raynal would write of Columbus's arrival in the New World. Tell me, reader, whether these were civilized people landing among savages or savages among civilized people. While the Spanish Empire centered on Mexico, Peru, and the West Indies, the hope of finding a new kingdom of gold soon led Spanish explorers into new territory. In 1508, Spain established the first permanent colony in what is now the United States. That first colony was not, as many people believe, at Jamestown, Virginia, or St. Augustine, Florida, but on the island of Puerto Rico, now a U.S. Commonwealth. Unlike many other European settlements that followed it, Puerto Rico had gold. Juan Ponce de Leon, who led the colony, sent a considerable amount to Spain, while keeping some for himself. In 1513, Ponce embarked for Florida in search of wealth, slaves, and a fountain of eternal youth, only to be repelled by local Indians. In 1528, another expedition seeking plunder in Florida embarked from Spain, but after a series of storms, only a handful of men reached the Gulf Coast. For 7 years, they traversed the Southwest until a few survivors arrived in Mexico in 1536. One, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, wrote an account of his adventures, including tales told by native inhabitants, possibly to persuade the newcomers to move on, of the 7 golden cities of Cibola, somewhere over the horizon. In the late 1530s and 40s, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo explored the Pacific coast as far north as present-day Oregon. Expeditions led by Hernando de Soto, Cabeza de Vaca, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, and others marched through the Gulf region and the Southwest, fruitlessly searching for another Mexico or Peru. Coronado explored much of the interior of the continent, reaching as far north as the Great Plains, and became the first European to encounter the immense herds of buffalo that roamed the West. These expeditions, really mobile communities with hundreds of adventurers, priests, potential settlers, slaves, and livestock, spread disease and devastation among Indian communities. De Soto's was particularly brutal. His men tortured, raped, and enslaved countless Indians and transmitted deadly diseases. When Europeans in the 17th century returned to colonize the area traversed by De Soto's party, little remained of the societies he had encountered. Where large towns had existed, explorers found only herds of grazing bison. Nonetheless, these explorations established Spain's claim to a large part of what is now the American South and Southwest. The first region to be colonized within the present-day United States was Florida. Spain hoped to establish a military base there to combat pirates who threatened the treasure fleet that each year sailed from Havana for Europe loaded with gold and silver from Mexico and Peru. Spain also wanted to forestall French incursions in the area. In 1565, Philip II of Spain authorized the nobleman Pedro Menéndez de Aviles to lead a colonizing expedition to Florida. Menéndez destroyed a small outpost at Fort Caroline, which a group of Huguenots, or French Protestants, had established in 1562 near present-day Jacksonville. Menéndez and his men massacred the 500 colonists and went on to establish Spanish forts on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, and at St. Augustine, Florida. The latter remains the oldest site in the continental United States, continuously inhabited by European settlers and their descendants. Spanish expeditions soon established forts from present-day Miami into South Carolina, and Spanish religious missionaries set up outposts in Florida and on the Sea Islands, hoping to convert the local Indians to Christianity. In 1566, 500 Spanish colonists landed near modern-day Port Royal, South Carolina, and established the settlement of Santa Elena. It survived until 1587, when the government in Spain ordered it abandoned and the inhabitants resettled over their vocal protests at St. Augustine to protect them from English naval raids. Most of the forts fell into disuse, and many of the missions were destroyed by local Guayl Indians in an uprising that began in 1597. The Indians explained their revolt by noting that the missionaries had sought to eliminate our dances, banquets, feasts, celebrations, and wars. They persecute our old people by calling them witches. The missions were soon rebuilt, only to be devastated again a century later, this time by English and Indian forces from South Carolina. In general, Florida failed to attract settlers, remaining an isolated military settlement, in effect a fortified outpost of Cuba. As late as 1763, Spanish Florida had only 4,000 inhabitants of European descent. Spain took even longer to begin the colonization of the American Southwest. Although Coronado and others made incursions into the area in the 16th century, their explorations were widely considered failures, since they had discovered neither gold nor advanced civilizations whose populations could be put to work for the Spanish Empire. Spain then neglected the area for another half-century. It was not until 1598 that Juan de Onat led a group of 400 soldiers, colonists, and missionaries north from Mexico to establish a permanent settlement. While searching for fabled deposits of precious metals, Onat's nephew and 14 soldiers were killed by inhabitants of Acoma, the sky city located on a high bluff in present-day New Mexico. Onat decided to teach the local Indians a lesson. After a 2-day siege, his forces scaled the seemingly impregnable heights and destroyed Acoma, killing more than 800 of its 1,500 or so inhabitants, including 300 women. Of the 600 Indians captured, the women and children were consigned to servitude in Spanish families, while adult men were punished by the cutting off of one foot. Not until the 1640s was Acoma, which had been inhabited since the 13th century, rebuilt. Onat's message was plain: any Indians who resisted Spanish authority would be crushed. But his method of rule, coupled with his failure to locate gold, alarmed authorities in Mexico City. In 1606, Onat was ordered home and punished for his treatment of New Mexico's Indians. In 1610, Spain established the capital of New Mexico at Santa Fe, the first permanent European settlement in the Southwest. In 1680, New Mexico's small and vulnerable colonist population numbered fewer than 3,000. Most were mestizos, persons of mixed Spanish and Indian origin, since few European settlers came to the region. Relations between the Pueblo Indians and colonial authorities had deteriorated throughout the 17th century, as governors, settlers, and missionaries sought to exploit the labor of an Indian population that declined from about 60,000 in 1600 to some 17,000 80 years later. Franciscan friars worked relentlessly to convert Indians to Catholicism, often using intimidation and violence. Their spiritual dedication and personal courage impressed many Indians, however, as did the European goods and technologies they introduced. Some natives welcomed them as a counterbalance to the depredations of soldiers and settlers and accepted baptism, even as they continued to practice their old religion, adding Jesus, Mary, and the Catholic saints to their already rich spiritual pantheon. But as the Inquisition, the persecution of non-Catholics, became more and more intense in Spain, so did the friars' efforts to stamp out traditional religious ceremonies in New Mexico. By burning Indian idols, masks, and other sacred objects, the missionaries alienated far more Indians than they converted. A prolonged drought that began around 1660, and the authorities' inability to protect the villages and missions from attacks by marauding Navajo and Apache Indians added to local discontent. The Pueblo peoples had long been divided among themselves. The Spanish assumed that the Indians could never unite against the colonizers. In August 1680, they were proven wrong. Little is known about the life of Pope, who became the main organizer of an uprising that aimed to drive the Spanish from the colony and restore the Indians' traditional autonomy. A religious leader born around 1630 in San Juan Pueblo, Pope first appears in the historical record in 1675, when he was one of 47 Pueblo Indians arrested for sorcery, that is, practicing their traditional religion. 4 of the prisoners were hanged, and the rest, including Pope, were brought to Santa Fe to be publicly whipped. After this humiliation, Pope returned home and began holding secret meetings in Pueblo communities. Under Pope's leadership, New Mexico's Indians joined in a coordinated uprising. Ironically, because the Pueblo spoke 6 different languages, Spanish became the revolt's lingua franca, a common means of communication among persons of different linguistic backgrounds. Some 2,000 warriors destroyed isolated farms and missions, killing 400 colonists, including 21 Franciscan missionaries. They then surrounded Santa Fe. The Spanish resisted fiercely, but eventually had no choice but to abandon the town. Most of the Spanish survivors, accompanied by several hundred Christian Indians, made their way south out of New Mexico. Within a few weeks, a century of colonization in the area had been destroyed. From their own point of view, the Pueblo Indians had triumphantly re-established the freedom lost through Spanish conquest. The Pueblo Revolt was the most complete victory for Native Americans over Europeans and the only wholesale expulsion of settlers in the history of North America. According to a royal attorney who interviewed the Spanish survivors in Mexico City, the revolt arose from the many oppressions the Indians had suffered. The victorious Pueblos turned with a vengeance on all symbols of European culture, uprooting fruit trees, destroying cattle, burning churches and images of Christ and the Virgin Mary, and wading into rivers to wash away their Catholic baptisms. They rebuilt their places of worship, called kivas, and resumed sacred dances the friars had banned. The God of the Spaniards, they shouted, is dead. Cooperation among the Pueblo peoples, however, soon evaporated. By the end of the 1680s, warfare had broken out among several villages, even as Apache and Navajo raids continued. Pope died around 1690. In 1692, the Spanish launched an invasion that reconquered New Mexico. Some communities welcomed them back as a source of military protection, but Spain had learned a lesson. In the 18th century, colonial authorities adopted a more tolerant attitude toward traditional religious practices and made fewer demands on Indian labor.